ISAF must develop a discerning approach that rewards competent Afghan governance and leadership, recognizes the distinction between incapacity and predatory behavior, and leverages ISAF's influence to address both challenges. ISAF and its partners must develop appropriate measures to reduce the incentives for corrupt actors that impede the mission, work around them if necessary, and develop actionable evidence of their malfeasance. Improving information collection and analysis will provide better understanding of the motivations, practices, and effects of corruption. Transparency and accountability. ICF must work with UNAMA and the international community to build a public finance mechanism that enables GIROA to create credible programs and to allocate resources according to the needs of the Afghan people. The international community must address its own corrupt or counterproductive practices, including reducing the amount of development money that goes toward overhead and intermediaries rather than the Afghan people. A recent OXFAM report indicates that a significant percentage of such funding is diverted. ICF must pay particular attention to how development projects are contracted and to whom. Too often these projects enrich power brokers, corrupt officials, or international contractors and serve only limited segments of the population. Improving ICF's knowledge of the environment and sharing this information with UNAMA and the international community will help mitigate such harmful practices. ISAF will provide economic support to counterinsurgency operations to help provide a bridge to critical development projects in priority areas that UN agencies and the international community cannot reach, while working closely with UNAMA to help set conditions for NGOs to enter stabilized areas. NGOs is non-government. Rule of law. Finally, ISAF must work with its civilian and international counterparts to enable justice sector reform and locate resources for formal and informal justice systems that offer swift and fair resolution of disputes, particularly at the local level. Provision of local justice to include such initiatives as mobile courts will be a critical enhancement of Afghan capacity in the eyes of the people. ISAF must work with GIROA to develop a clear mandate and boundaries for local informal justice systems. 3. Gain the initiative and evolve in stages. ISAF's new strategy will include 3 stages. These stages will unfold at different rates and times in different geographic areas of Afghanistan. Most importantly, they will be led increasingly by Afghan people and their government. Gain the initiative. First, ISAF must refocus its operations to gain the initiative in seriously threatened populated areas by working directly with GIROA institutions and people in local communities to gain their support and to diminish insurgent access and influence. This stage is clearly decisive to the overall effort. It will require sufficient resources to gain the initiative and definitively check the insurgency. A failure to reverse the momentum of the insurgency will not only preclude success in Afghanistan, it will result in a loss of public and political support outside of Afghanistan. In this stage, ISAF will take a new approach to integrate fully with ANSF through extensive partnering. This will enable improved effectiveness and a more rapid growth of ANSF capability. Together with UNAMA and the international community, ISAF will work with all levels of GIROA to expand substantially responsive and accountable governance that focus on the needs of the people. Finally, there must be full international community support and commitments to the full range of civil military capabilities concentrated in the priority areas. Strategic consolidation. As ISAF and ANSF capabilities grow over the next 12 to 24 months and the insurgency diminishes in critical areas, ISAF will begin a second stage, strategic consolidation. As ANSF and GIROA increasingly take the lead for security operations as the new civilian military capacity arrives, security operations will expand to wider areas while consolidating initial gains. These efforts will increase the space in which the population feels protected and served by their government and insulate them from the return of insurgent influence. Meanwhile, ANSF and ISAF must have the capability to respond flexibility to insurgent adaptation and retain the initiative. Sustained security. When the insurgent groups no longer pose an existential threat to GIROA, ISAF will move into a third stage of sustained security to ensure achieved gains are durable as ISAF force begins to draw down. As ANSF demonstrates the capability to defeat remaining pockets of insurgents on their own, ISAF will transition to train, advise, and assist role. UNAMA and the international community will have increased freedom of action to continue to help develop the Afghan state and meet the needs of the Afghan people. In all these stages, the insurgents will adapt, possibly moving their operations to different areas. This risk is mitigated by the fact that the insurgents are weakened when forced to relocate from their traditional areas. The burden of migration, renewed recruiting, and re-establishing a stronghold will incur costs to the insurgents. ISAF must have the capability to respond to these adaptations. Prioritize allocation of resources to threatened populations. In a country as large as complex as Afghanistan, ISAF cannot be strong everywhere. ISAF must focus its full range of civilian military resources where they will have the greatest effect on the people. This will generally be in those specific geographical areas that represent key terrain. For the counterinsurgent, the key terrain is generally where the population lives and works. This is also where the insurgents are typically focused. Thus, it is here where the population is threatened by the enemy, and that two sides inevitably meet. ISAF will initially focus on critical high population areas that are contested or controlled by insurgents, not because the enemy is present, but because it is here that the population is threatened by the insurgency. The geographical deployment of focus may not be static. ISAF must retain the operational flexibility to adapt to change in the environment. Based on the current assessments, ISAF prioritized the effort in Afghanistan into three categories to guide the allocation of resources. These priorities will evolve over time as conditions on the ground change. Assessment measuring progress. ISAF must develop effective assessment architectures in concert with civilian partners and home nations to measure the effects of the strategy, assess progress toward key objectives, and make necessary adjustments. ISAF must identify and refine appropriate indicators to assess progress, clarifying the difference between operational measures of effectiveness critical to practitioners on the ground and strategic measures more appropriate to national capitals. Because the mission depends on GIROA, ISAF must also develop clear metrics to assess progress and governance. Resources and risk. Proper resourcing will be critical. The campaign in Afghanistan has been historically under-resourced and remains so today. ISAF is operating in a culture of poverty. Consequently, ISAF requires more forces. This increase partially reflects previously validated yet unsourced requirements. This also stems from the new mix of capabilities essential to execute the new strategy. Some efficiency will be gained through better use of ISF's existing resources. Eliminating the redundancy and the leveraging of ANSF growth increases the GROA capacity, international community resources, and population itself. Nonetheless, ISAF requires capabilities and resources well in excess of these efficiency gains. The greater resources will not be sufficient to achieve success, but will enable implementation of the new strategy. Conversely, inadequate resources will likely result in failure. However, without a new strategy, the mission should not be resourced. A properly resourced strategy provides the means deemed necessary to accomplish the mission with appropriate and acceptable risk. In the case of Afghanistan, this level of resourcing is less than the amount that is required to secure the whole country. By comparison, a fully resourced strategy could achieve low risk, but this would be excessive in the final analysis. Some areas are more consequential for the survival of GIROA than others. The determination of what constitutes properly resourced will be based on force density doctrine applied with best military judgment of factors such as terrain, location, accessibility of the population, intensity of the threats, the effect of ISR capabilities, and other enablers, logistical constraints, and historical experience. As always, assessment of risk will necessarily include subjective professional judgment. Under-resourcing coin is perilous because the insurgent has the advantage of mobility, whereas security forces become relatively fixed after securing an area. Force density doctrine is based on historical analysis and suggests that a certain presence of the security force is required to achieve a critical threshold that overmatches the insurgent's ability to leverage their mobility. In short, a properly resourced strategy places enough things in enough places for enough time. All three are mandatory. Properly resourced strategy is imperative. Resourcing coalition forces below this level will leave critical areas of Afghanistan open to insurgent influence while the ANSF grows. Thus, the first stage of the strategy will be unachievable, leaving GIROA and ISAF unable to execute the decisive second stage. In addition, the international community is unlikely to have the access necessary to facilitate effective Afghan governance in contested areas. Failure to provide adequate resources also risks a longer conflict, greater casualties, higher overall costs, and ultimately a critical loss of political support. Any of these risks, in turn, are likely to result in mission failure. Civilian capacity. ISAF cannot succeed without a corresponding cadre of civilian experts to support the change in strategy and capitalize on the expansion and acceleration of counterinsurgency efforts. Effective civilian capabilities and resourcing mechanisms are critical to achieving demonstrable progress. The relative level of civilian resources must be balanced with security forces, lest gains in security outpace civilian capacity for governance and economic improvements. In particular, ensuring alignment of resources for immediate and rapid expansion into newly secured areas will require integrated civil-military planning teams that establish mechanisms for rapid response. In addition, extensive work is required to ensure international and host nation partners are engaged and fully integrated. ISAF's efforts in Afghanistan must be directed through its Afghan counterparts to enable them to succeed in the long term.